Montana Territory, 1885. The town of Antler Creek knew Della Hayes by the smell of her bread before most of them ever bothered to learn her name. They knew her by other things too. By the width of her shoulders and the size of her hands, and the way the boards of the drover's rest kitchen announced her when she crossed them. They had a dozen jokes about her, and she had heard every one of them through the pass-through window while she worked, and she had kept working because the biscuits did not care what the men eating them said about the woman who made them. What none of them knew, not the hotel man who paid her half wages, not the ladies who smiled at her sideways, not the young hands who laid money on the table and dared each other toward her, was that the most powerful man in 3 counties was about to walk through that kitchen door. And that before the spring drive went north, he would stand up in front of every cattleman in the territory and burn his hole standing to the ground rather than let one more person laugh at her. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Della Hayes had come west in 1879 with her brother Nathan, who had a homestead filing in his pocket and a cough he swore was nothing. The cough was not nothing. He lasted 2 winters. The claim lapsed because a woman alone could not prove up a quarter section and bury a brother in the same season, no matter what the pamphlets back east promised. And when the land went back to the government, Della walked into Antler Creek with $11, a cast-iron Dutch oven that had belonged to her mother, and nothing else that mattered. Vernon Sims hired her at the drover's rest because his last cook had run off with a faro dealer and the cattle season was coming. He told her plainly, in the way of a man who believed plainness excused cruelty, that he was doing her a kindness. "A woman your size," he said, looking her over the way he might look over a draft horse, "ought to be grateful for inside work." He paid her $12 a month when the cook before her had drawn 20. Della knew it. Sims knew she knew it. He counted on her having nowhere else to go, and for 6 years he was right. She was 36 years old now, big through the shoulders, big through the hips, with forearms a blacksmith would have respected and a face that had been pretty once by anybody's measure and was handsome still by any honest one. She rose at 4. She had the bread proofing by 1/2 past. By 6 the smell of it moved down the main street of Antler Creek like a church bell, and men who had never once spoken a decent word to her followed that smell through the front door and paid Vernon Sims for the privilege of eating what her hands had made. The drover's rest dining room sat between the kitchen and the street, and the pass-through window between kitchen and dining room had no shutter. Della had asked for one, her 2nd year. Sims had laughed and said the boys liked to see where their food came from. So she heard everything. She heard the drummers from Chicago rate the women of the town like livestock and put her at the bottom for sport. She heard ranch hands, boys of 19 and 20 with their first season's wages, work up the nerve to call things through the window, and she heard the laughter that followed. And she learned which voices belonged to which hats so that she could salt their eggs exactly right anyway. That was the part none of them ever understood. She fed them well on purpose, not to win them, because the food was hers, and the food was honest, and she had decided a long time ago that they could make her invisible, but they could not make her careless. There was one table by the window where the better class of Antler Creek sat when they came in for Sunday dinner. Mrs. Pruitt, the banker's wife, held that table the way a general holds a hill. She was a thin woman with a talent for saying vicious things in a charitable voice, and her favorite subject, when the roast was late or the gravy thin, was the cook. "Poor creature," she would say, loud enough for the pass-through. "I suppose when one looks like that, one consoles oneself with the spoon." The ladies around her would laugh behind their gloves. Della would plate the next course and send it out hot and perfect, and Mrs. Pruitt would eat every bite of it. And that was the arrangement the town had settled into. They took what she made and mocked what she was, and the years went by. She kept one thing for herself. Sunday evenings, after the dinner service, when the dining room emptied and Sims went off to the saloon to lose at cards, Della cooked for whoever in Antler Creek had gone without. There were always a few. Old Pete Mullins, who had wrangled horses for 30 years until a green colt took his hip apart, and the outfits stopped hiring him. The Lindqvist widow and her 3 children, holding a town lot and not much else since the diphtheria came through. A drifter or 2 off the Miles City road, men with winter in their faces. They came to the kitchen door, never the front, and Della fed them off the day's ends and her own wages, and she never once told a soul, and Vernon Sims never once noticed that the larder ran a little light on Mondays, because Vernon Sims had never counted anything in his life except money owed to him. That was the whole shape of her world. The November evening the weather turned. The wind came down off the Bull Mountains around 4 o'clock, carrying the first hard snow of the season, the kind that arrives sideways and means it. And by 6 the street was empty and white, and the lamps of the Drovers' Rest were the only warm thing showing for 40 miles of open country. Della was banking the stove for the night when she heard horses. Several of them, ridden hard, pulling up out front. Then boots on the porch and the front door, and Vernon Sims's voice climbing into the register he saved for men whose money mattered. Mr. Calloway. Lord above, Mr. Calloway, coming out of that. What in the world has you out in this? Della went still at the stove. Everybody in the territory knew the name. Adam Calloway ran the long bar C, 11,000 head on grass that stretched from Antler Creek halfway to the Muscle Shell. And the saying in 3 counties was that the railroad asked his permission before it scheduled. He banked in Helena, not at Pruitt's little brick building. He had buried a wife years back, people said, and had been polite and unreachable ever since. A big, quiet man who came to town twice a year, settled his accounts, and went home. Della had seen him exactly 4 times in 6 years, always through the pass-through window, always at a distance. Bridge is out at Sanders Crossing, she heard him say. His voice was low and even and carried anyway, the way some voices do. We've been since noon getting around it. I've got 5 men and 6 horses, and the horses come first. Then whatever your kitchen can do. Kitchen's closed, I'm afraid, but I can wake the cook, of course. For you I can certainly. Don't wake anybody on my account. It's no trouble at all, Sims said, in the voice of a man volunteering someone else's trouble. And then the kitchen door swung open, and he put his head through, and his face did the thing it always did when he looked at her, a small involuntary settling of contempt, like a man checking that his boot scraper was where he left it. Della, Mr. Adam Calloway, and 5 of his riders. Whatever's quickest. And mind you don't embarrass me. The door swung shut. Della looked at her banked stove for a moment. Then she rolled her sleeves back down to the wrist, the way she did when the work got serious, and rolled them right back up again, and got to it. What she sent out 40 minutes later was this. A kettle of beef and barley soup built off the stock she kept living on the back of the stove the way other women kept a fire in the parlor. Cornbread in the Dutch oven, crackling at the edges, with sorghum and the last of the good butter. Fried salt pork and potatoes with onion, enough for working men, which is to say enough for 10. And coffee strong enough to apologize for the weather. She fed Sims's pride along with it, sent everything through the pass-through, and stayed in her kitchen where she belonged. For a while there was only the sound of weather against the windows and 6 tired men eating, which is a particular kind of silence and a high compliment in any language. Then she heard chairs and low voices, and she was scrubbing the soup kettle when she became aware that someone was standing in the kitchen doorway. Not Sims. Sims never stood anywhere. He hovered. This was a stillness. Adam Calloway filled the doorway without trying to. He was a year or 2 past 40, big through the chest, hat in his hands, snowmelt still dark on the shoulders of his coat. Up close his face had more weather in it than his name suggested, lines at the eyes that could have come from squinting or grief or both. And he stood there with the unhurried manner of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be listened to. Wanted to thank the cook, he said. Sims tells me you'd already shut down for the night. It's no matter, Della said. She kept scrubbing. People did this sometimes, came back to be charming at her for a minute so they could feel decent about themselves. It cost nothing to let them. It's some matter, he said. That soup stock was 3 days old at least. You don't get that off a quick fire. She looked up at that. He nodded at the stove, at the back burner, at the stock pot sitting where it always sat. My mother kept a pot going like that. Said a kitchen without one was just a room where food happened to be. She was right. She generally was. He turned the hat in his hands once, like a wheel he was checking for true. The cornbread. That was buttermilk and bacon grease, and you scalded the meal first. Della set the kettle down. In 6 years, through that pass-through window, no human being had ever once asked her how she made anything. They had eaten it, paid Sims for it, and rated her body on the way out. You cook, Mr. Calloway? I ran a roundup wagon 2 seasons when I was young and stupid, before I had cattle of my own. Worst cook on the northern range, My own men told me so. But a man who's done a thing badly knows the difference when he meets it done right. He said it without flourish, a plain report. Then he put his hat on, which meant he was leaving, and paused with one hand on the doorframe. There were 6 plates went back through that window, and not one word of thanks come the other way, I'd wager. That's a poor arrangement. The food was the best I've had in some years, and I've eaten in Chicago. Good night to you, ma'am. He was gone before she could decide what her face was doing. She heard him in the dining room settling with Sims, heard Sims's laugh climbing and falling, heard the front door and the wind, and then nothing. On the table by the pass-through, when she went to clear it, the plates were stacked. 6 working men, and somebody had made them stack their plates. Under the top one lay a $5 gold piece, which was not for Sims, because Calloway had already paid Sims at the desk, and they both would know it. She stood looking at the coin for a long moment. Then she put it in the tobacco tin behind the flour bin where she kept the Lindqvist Children's Winter Boots Fund, and she told herself it meant nothing, and she was wrong. He came back in December. No storm to blame it on. He had business at the land office, he said, filings to check on a lease section out toward the divide, and he took his dinner at the Drover's Rest at 2 in the afternoon when the dining room stood empty, and when Sims tried to sit with him, he said, polite as church, that he had papers to read. He did have papers. He read them. But when Della sent out the plate, pot roast with a coffee and molasses gravy she had never once wasted on the Sunday crowd, he ate it slowly, and afterward he came and stood in the kitchen doorway again with his hat in his hands. That gravy, coffee in it, and molasses, and a little vinegar at the end. Vinegar. He considered that the way other men considered cattle prices. Wouldn't have guessed vinegar. That's the point of it. You're not supposed to find it. You're only supposed to miss it if it's gone. Something moved through his face then, quick, there and covered, like a fish rising in still water. It took her a week to understand what she had said and how a widower might hear it. By then he had been back once more, and the third time he did not pretend to have papers. He sat at the small table nearest the kitchen, the one with the wobbled leg that Della had been asking Sims to fix since 1881, and he talked to her through the open door while she worked the afternoon bread. Not courting talk, cattle talk, weather talk, the small genuine commerce of 2 grown people comparing the world. He told her the lease section he was after had water the rest of his North Range needed, and that Lyle Decker over at the Stockgrowers Association wanted the same section, and that Decker had the association behind him and 3 senators in his pocket, and a daughter he kept trying to seat next to Calloway at suppers in Miles City. He said that last part flat, the way a man reports a fence down. She told him about Nathan. She had not planned to. It came out the way the truth does in a warm kitchen in the late afternoon, between the punching down of the dough and the shaping of it, and he listened with his whole stillness, and when she finished he did not say he was sorry for her loss. He said, what was the claim? And she told him, the southeast quarter of Section 14 out on Box Elder Creek, and he nodded slowly, like a man filing something away, and said her brother had picked good ground, the kind of thing that takes an eye, and that she should be proud of him. It was the first time in 4 years anyone had let Nathan be something other than a sad story. She had to turn to the oven so he would not see what that did to her. Antler Creek, being a small town, noticed. Antler Creek, being the kind of small town it was, decided the whole thing was the best joke of the winter. Adam Calloway, the biggest man in the territory, riding 2 hours each way to sit by a kitchen door. The phrase that went around, coined at Pruitt's Bank and polished at the saloon, was that Calloway had developed a taste for large portions. Men said it where Della could hear it. Women said it where she was meant to hear it. Mrs. Pruitt said it at the Sunday table in her charitable voice, with a new garnish. Of course a man that rich can afford any indulgence. Though one wonders what his poor wife would say. She was such a slight, lovely thing. Della heard that one through the pass-through with a tray of dishes in her hands, and she did not drop the tray, and she did not throw it either, and afterward she stood in the larder with her back against the shelves for exactly 1 minute by her own counting, which was the allowance she gave herself, and then she went back to work. She was used to being the joke. She had 6 years of practice being the joke. What she could not get used to, what kept her up that night staring at the ceiling of her little room behind the kitchen, was that they had found a way to make him part of it. A good man was being laughed at in 2 counties for the crime of talking to her, and she lay there in the dark and decided, with the calm of a woman salting a wound she had salted before, that the kindest thing she could do for Adam Calloway was to close the kitchen door. So she closed it. The next time he came, the first week of January, with the cold standing in the street like a wall, the kitchen door was shut and the pass-through served his plate without a word riding along on it. He sat at the wobbly table alone. He ate. He waited longer than another man would have waited. Then he paid and left, and Della watched his back through the frost on the window and told herself she had done him a service, and the kitchen had never in 6 years felt so much like a place she was kept rather than a place she worked. He came back twice more in January and twice in February, and the door stayed shut, and he never once knocked on it, which was its own kind of message. He simply ate and left the stacked plate and went home through the cold. The fifth time, there was a scrap of paper under the plate, torn off something larger, with handwriting on it like fence wire, blunt and functional. It said, "The gravy's gone to vinegar without the vinegar. Whatever I did, name it and I'll mend it. If it's the town, that's mine to mend too." A.C. She kept the note. She did not answer it. March came in wet, and the town thawed into mud and meanness, and that was when the McGuire boy made his wager. Dan McGuire was 20 years old, rode for the Pruitt family's little vanity herd, and possessed the special cruelty of a young man who suspects he is nobody and is in a hurry to prove otherwise at someone else's expense. The Founders' Dance came every March at the Grange Hall, the whole town in one room, fiddles and lamplight, and a long table of food that, by tradition nobody acknowledged, Della Hayes cooked, and other women claimed. She went every year, not to dance. Nobody had asked Della Hayes to dance in the entire history of the Montana Territory. She went because she had cooked the food and she was owed the looking at it, and she stood each year near the kitchen end of the hall in her good dress, the gray wool she had turned twice and kept decent, and she watched the town eat her work, and at a reasonable hour she went home. It was a small, defended pleasure, and she had earned it, and that year they took it from her. She heard the laughing first, the particular conspiratorial register of young men by the punch bowl, and she should have known. She had 6 years of knowing. But the fiddles were loud and her guard was a half-inch low, and so when Dan McGuire crossed the floor in front of the whole assembled town, bowed like a courtier in a penny dreadful, and asked her in a carrying voice for the honor of the next dance, there was one full second, one, in which Della Hayes believed him. The hope got all the way up into her face before she saw, past his shoulder, the table of young men with their fists stuffed against their mouths, and the silver dollars stacked by the punch bowl, and Lewis Pruitt, the banker's son, already wheezing with the joke of it. $1 says she believes you. That had been the wager. She understood it whole, in an instant, the way you understand a knife. What the town saw next, and would argue about for years, was this. Della Hayes looked at Dan McGuire for a long, level moment, with the hope dying in her face by visible degrees and something older and harder arriving to administer the estate. Then she said, in a voice that carried exactly as far as his had, "No, thank you, Mr. McGuire. I've seen how you ride. A man that heavy-handed with a good-mouthed horse would be no use at all in a waltz." And she turned, unhurried, and walked the length of the Grange Hall toward the door, through a silence breaking up into laughter behind her, and some of the laughter now had a new direction to it, and none of that helped her at all, because the $1 had been paid out by the punch bowl, and the second of hope had happened in front of everyone, and they had seen it. They had seen her believe. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She made it to the dark of the lane beside the Grange before her breathing went. Mud to the ankles of her good shoes, fiddle music coming through the wall bright and stupid, and Della stood with one hand on the cold clapboard, getting her wind back the way she had learned to, slow, in force, while inside they two-stepped on her 1 second of believing. She did not hear him come around the corner of the building. For a big man, he moved like weather. She only knew he was there when his coat arrived around her shoulders, enormous and smelling of horse and snow and pipe smoke, and Adam Calloway stepped past her to the lane's edge and stood looking out at the dark with his hands behind his back, giving her the privacy of his turned shoulders, and said nothing at all for the better part of 2 minutes. Then he said, "I was at the door when it happened. Came late on purpose. I find these things go easier if I miss the speeches." A pause. "I'd have crossed the floor, but you were already handling it, and a thing like that is worse if somebody rescues you from it." You don't need rescuing. Never met a woman who needed it less. The fiddles sawed away behind the wall. Somewhere up the street a dog had opinions. But I'll tell you what I stood there and learned tonight, if you'll hear it. Della pulled the coat closed at her throat. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. It's a free territory. I learned I'm a coward, Adam Calloway said. For months I've been riding down here, telling myself it was for the cooking, letting you carry the whole cost of it. The town's been laughing and I let them laugh, because the laughing only landed on you. And you bore it so well I let myself believe it wasn't landing at all. And tonight a boy with a borrowed dollar walked across that floor and did what I haven't had the nerve to do in front of anybody, even as a joke. He turned around then. In the dark she could only make out the shape of him, the snow starting again in small dry flakes between them. I'm 44 years old, Della. I buried a wife I loved, and I learned to live quiet. And quiet turned into hiding so gradually I never caught it happening. I have 11,000 head of cattle and the respect of every man in this territory, and I gave them that respect to hold, which means they can drop it whenever I displease them. And I have arranged my whole life these last years around not displeasing anybody. And the finest person I have met since my wife died has spent the winter shutting her own kitchen door to protect me from laughter. That is what my standing has been worth. That's the use it's been put to. You don't owe me anything, Della said. You were kind. That's rarer than you know. Let it be what it was. I don't want to let it be what it was. Then you want to be ruined. She said it flatly, the kitchen voice, the one that settled arguments about whether the roast was done. You think I don't know how it works? I have stood behind that window 6 years, Mr. Calloway. I have heard this town take the measure of every soul that walks down that street. You sit by my kitchen door, they laugh at you in the saloon. You walk me down the main street on a Sunday, Lyle Decker reads you out of the association by summer, and there goes your shipping pool, and there goes your lease section, and his daughter's spite comes free with the rest of it. I am not worth 11,000 head of cattle. Nobody is. That's not low spirits talking, that's arithmetic. The snow came down between them, small and dry. When he spoke again his voice had something new in it, and it took her a moment to recognize the thing, because she had never once heard Adam Calloway amused. You know what I had before cattle? He said. Nothing. I came up from Texas in '66 pushing another man's bees for 30 a month and found. Slept on the ground 11 years. Everything I have, I built knowing it could burn, blow away, freeze, or die of the fever, and most winters some of it does. The only thing a man truly keeps is what he'd build back from nothing for. He took the hat off, an absurd courtesy in the dark and the snow, and held it against his chest. I'm not going to ask you for anything tonight. You've been asked enough for one evening by fools, and I won't stand in their line. But the Stockgrowers' spring meeting is the 20th of April in this very hall, supper and a dance after. Every cattleman and every grand family in 3 counties, Decker presiding. I'm asking you to do me the honor of attending as my guest. In front of all of them. Not the kitchen door. The front one. They'll eat you alive. They'll try it, Adam Calloway said. I've wintered worse. And he set the hat back on his head and walked off up the lane into the snow, leaving her standing there in a coat the size of a tent, warm for the first time since the fiddles started. Word travels in cattle country the way fire travels in August grass. By the 1st of April, Lyle Decker knew. Decker was 60, silver at the temples, president of the Stockgrowers Association for 9 years running, and he had built his position the way other men build dams, patiently, with an eye to what every stone held back. He ran 20,000 head, but his real herd was favors. The spring shipping pool, the contract that put the whole district's beef on the Northern Pacific cars at a rate no single outfit could touch, went where Decker pointed it. The lease sections on the divide went to men Decker liked. His daughter Caroline, 26 and elegant and bored to the edge of cruelty by life in Miles City, had been pointed at Adam Calloway for 2 seasons the way an outfit points a brand at a maverick. Decker rode out to the long bar see himself on the 9th of April, which was itself a message. Kings do not usually deliver their own letters, and the 2 men sat on Calloway's porch with the spring work loud in the corrals below, and Decker did him the courtesy of getting to it. There's talk going around, Decker said, that I'd be embarrassed to repeat, so I'll only ask you to kill it. Tell me you're not squiring the fat cook from Sims's hotel to the spring meeting, and we'll speak no more about it. Her name is Miss Della Hayes, Calloway said, and I am, and we won't. Decker looked out at the corrals for a while. He was not a shouter. Men who can take things away never need to be. I knew your wife, he said at last. Margaret was a fine woman. I stood at her funeral. So hear me as a friend before you hear me as anything else. A man grieves. A man gets lonely. A man develops appetites. Nobody begrudges any of it. But there are arrangements for that, and the arrangements are private, and this is not private. You'd make the whole association a joke from here to Cheyenne. The Helena papers already call us land hogs and barons. Now the biggest of us takes up with a hired cook the size of a chuck wagon, in public, like a man who's lost his reason. He let that sit. Here's the rest, and then I'm done. The pool ships the 3rd week of May. Your 11,000 head are penciled in. Pencil rubs out, Adam. And that lease section on the divide that your North Range is dying for? The land office does what the association recommends, and the association does what I recommend. You've built a fine thing. 20 years of work. I'm asking you not to set fire to it over a woman the whole territory is laughing at. Calloway was quiet for a moment. Down in the corral, a bronc fought the snubbing post and lost, the way they mostly do. You done? I'm done. Then I'll say my piece once, so you can carry it back accurate. He turned and looked at Decker, and afterward Decker would tell his wife there had been nothing hot in the look at all, which had bothered him more than anger would have. I came into this country with one horse. Every man who ever helped me when it cost him something is dead or poor, and every man who's flattered me since I got rich would skin me for the hide price the day it paid better. In 20 years of your suppers and your meetings, I have heard 10,000 words about honor, and the only honorable thing I've watched happen all winter is a hotel cook feeding the broke and the crippled out the back door of a man who shorts her wages, and doing it secret, so nobody's pride takes a mark. You all laugh at her size. She's twice what any of us is, Lyle, and I've done my own arithmetic, and I'll take the rubbing out. Pool or no pool, lease or no lease. Now stay for dinner if you care to. My cook's nothing special, but a man who rode this far shouldn't go back hungry. Decker did not stay for dinner. By the 15th, everyone from Antler Creek to the Yellowstone knew the lines that had been drawn, and money was changing hands in the saloons over whether Calloway would lose his nerve, and Vernon Sims had developed a sudden purring deference toward his own kitchen that turned Della's stomach worse than 6 years of his contempt ever had. And Della herself, who had said yes in the lane mostly because the snow in the coat and the bared honesty of the man had made it impossible to say anything else, woke every morning of that April at 4 o'clock with her heart going like a trapped bird, and got up and made the bread anyway. She had one dress remade. Mrs. Lindqvist, it turned out, had been a seamstress in Stockholm, and the two of them worked 3 evenings by lamplight on a bolt of deep green wool that Della had bought years ago and never had the courage to cut, and what came off the table at the end of it was not a disguise and was not an apology. It fit her. That was the whole revolution of it. It was a dress built for the body she had, by a woman who owed her kindness and paid the debt in straight seams, and when Della stood in it on the evening of the 20th of April, in her little room behind the kitchen, she looked in the spotted mirror and saw, for the first time and longer than she would admit, somebody it would take nerve to laugh at. He came for her in the buggy at 6, in his black suit, and he came to the front door of the Drover's Rest, past Sims, and offered his arm in the doorway with the whole main street watching from under hat brims and behind curtains. The Grange Hall was 400 yards up the street. They walked it. That was his answer to the betting in the saloons, that walk, slow, in the long gold light of the spring evening. The biggest cattleman in 3 counties with the hotel cook on his arm. Mudd avoided, gazes met, and Della kept her chin level the whole way because the dress had been built by a friend, and the arm under her hand had never once trembled, and she would be damned before hers would. The hall went quiet when they came through the door. Quiet in the manner of a held breath. 200 people deciding all at once that they were about to watch either a wedding or a hanging, and not caring much which. The long tables were laid. The lamps were lit. Caroline Decker stood near the head table in Paris silk with her face composed into perfect, glittering pleasantness, and Lyle Decker himself came down the center of the room to meet them, because a king cannot let a challenge cross his whole court unanswered, and the fiddles, which had been tuning, thought better of it. Adam. Decker's voice was warm and carried to the walls. We'd about given up on you. His eyes went to Della, down her, up her, a public inventory, and he smiled the smile that had moved senators. And you've brought your cook. How charitable. Did Sims close the kitchen for the night? Or will the lady need to get back to her pots? It got the laugh he had built it for. Not the whole room. But enough. The Pruitt table loudest. Louis Pruitt's wheeze riding over the top. And Della felt the old heat come up her neck and stand in her ears. And she had her mouth open to answer. She had something. She was reaching for it. When Adam Calloway did the thing that 3 counties would still be arguing about when the railroad came through 20 years later and gave them something new to discuss. He stepped up onto a chair, and from the chair onto the end of the nearest table, between a dish of pickled beets and somebody's good gloves, 6 feet and some inches of him standing on the furniture at a formal supper like a man about to auction the room. And he said, in the voice he used on cattle and rivers, since we're all gathered, I have an announcement, and Lyle, seeing as you've opened the subject of this lady, you'll want to hear it most of all. You could have heard of Mothland. Most of you know my brand, he said. 20 years I've sat in this association, shipped in this pool, and held my tongue at these suppers while we congratulated ourselves on building up the country. Fine. Here's what I've watched get built this winter. I watched this town take 6 years of the best work in it from a woman it never once thanked, at half wages, and call her names through a window while she fed them. I watched a boy bet a silver dollar on her loneliness at the Founders' Dance, and I watched a roomful of grown Christians laugh, and I've spent some time since wondering what exactly we think the difference is between that and what I'd whip a man off my place for doing to a dog. The room had gone very still in a new way now, the way a room goes when it has stopped watching a show and started being seen. Mr. Decker rode out to my place this month and offered me a trade. Drop Miss Hayes, keep my place in the pool and my lease on the divide. He'll deny it gentlemanly, and I'll not press it, because I'm about to make the trade in front of witnesses instead. He took the folded papers from inside his coat, and even from the floor Della could see the land office seals on them. This morning I withdrew my cattle from the spring pool. All 11,000. I'll ship private and eat the difference. And any small outfit that's been waiting years for room in that pool. There's room now. Go get it. And this paper here is my application on the divide lease, which I have today withdrawn in favor of the second applicant, who I'm told is Mrs. Inga Lindqvist of Antler Creek, a widow with 3 children and a town lot, who'll run sheep on it. Lyle, sheep, right up against your north fence, and I have personally guaranteed her note at the bank in Helena. He folded the papers away. The silence had teeth in it now. There's the price of laughing at Della Hayes, gentlemen. I find it cheap at the rate. Anybody who feels otherwise knows where the Long Bar Sea is, and I promise you the cooking there is about to be the envy of the territory. And then, because the room still had not found its breath, he stepped down off the table, straightened his coat, walked to Della through the aisle that opened for him the way water opens for a keel, and held out his hand, and said, in a completely different voice, one that no one in that hall had ever heard from him, and that belonged to her alone, although 200 people stood in the splash of it, Miss Hayes, I believe I never have had the honor. May I have this dance? The fiddles, God bless the fiddles, struck up before anyone could decide whether they were allowed to. She danced with him. She had not danced since she was 19 years old in Ohio, and she stepped on his foot once, and he said, "Lo, I've been stepped on by worse." And she laughed, actually laughed, out loud, in the middle of the Grange Hall floor, and that sound did more damage to the old order of Antler Creek than the speech had. Because a joke only works while its subject can be kept miserable, and there she was in green wool, turning under the lamps in the arms of the biggest man in the territory, visibly, unanswerably happy. Caroline Decker left before the second waltz. The Pruitt table found the punch fascinating. And old Pete Mullins, who had been let in the side door the way he was let in everywhere, stood by the wall with his ruined hip and clapped time with his hat against his leg, grinning like the spring. The cost came due, as costs do. Decker was not a man to take a public wound and offer his other cheek. The pool shipped in May without the Long Bar Sea, and Calloway's private freight rate ran dear, and that summer 2 of his line camps had trouble proving up leases that had never been trouble before, and the Miles City suppers went on without him. He had told her the truth in the snow that night. They tried to eat him alive. What Decker had not figured on, what men like Decker never figure, was how many small outfits had spent years pressed against the glass of that shipping pool, and how they remembered who had thrown the door open and named them out loud. By autumn, the Long Bar Sea had standing offers from a dozen little brands to throw in together on a private drive, and the buyers came anyway, because 11,000 head is 11,000 head, and a Chicago buyer with money on the table has never once in the history of beef cared what the local association thought of a man's heart. What the buyers talked about, all the way back down the line to the stockyards, was the cooking. Because Della Hayes gave Vernon Sims her notice on the 1st of May, and Sims, who had finally and far too late done his own arithmetic, offered her $20 a month, then $25, then $30, each number a confession with a price on it, and she listened to all of them with the patience she had learned at his pass-through window, and said, "Mr. Sims, you've been short with me $11 a month for 6 years. I make that near $800. I'll let it go for the look on your face this exact minute, which I intend to keep." And she packed her mother's Dutch oven and the tobacco tin from behind the flour bin, and she rode out to the Long Bar C, hired, openly, at a wage she named herself, to run the cookhouse for the Roundup. The Roundup cookhouse of the Long Bar C became, in one season, a thing men signed on for. Hands turned down better wages on other outfits to ride for Calloway's wagon, and the Chicago buyer who came up in September wrote his partners that the beef was prime, but the supper was the reason to make the trip twice. She fed 40 men off a wagon and a fire like it was a hotel in Denver. She fed the small outfits when the joint drive gathered, fed Mrs. Lindqvist's children on visits to the sheep lease until they were brown and loud, fed old Pete Mullins, who Calloway had hired at full wages to mind the horse herd nobody else had patience for, and who told anyone who would listen that he had died of that hip in '81, and this was heaven, and the food proved it. Adam Calloway courted her that whole summer the way he did everything, steadily, without noise, with his hat in his hands. And in October, on a Sunday, he asked her to ride into Antler Creek with him, and stop the buggy in front of the old Birch Hotel, which had stood empty on the main street since '82, 2 stories of good lumber and dust, and he handed her a paper, and stood there working the brim of his hat while she read it. It was a deed, recorded at the county seat the Tuesday before, the seals and the recorder's stamp on it, the lot and building described in the surveyor's language, section and block and all. Grantee, Della Hayes. Her name alone, in the county book, in ink, where it would outlast every laugh ever laughed in that town. "Before you say anything," he said, "hear the why of it. I'm going to ask you to marry me. Not today. Today you'd suspect the question was hiding inside the gift, and you'd be right to look. I'm asking at Christmas, fair warning, and between now and then I want one thing settled where the whole county can read it. Whatever answer you give me, this building is yours. Yours if you say yes, yours if you say no, yours if I'm thrown by a horse Tuesday. You came into this country with $11 and a Dutch oven, and you have been at the mercy of one small man or another ever since, and that ends here, on this street, in front of these windows. Open a restaurant. Open nothing. Let it stand empty out of spite. It's deeded, it's recorded, and it cannot be taken back by me or anybody." He put his hat on, and his voice went rough at the edge for the first time since she had known him. "Nobody should have to be loved to be safe, Della. You'll be safe first. Then, if you'll have me, loved after, and for good." She opened the restaurant in November. She called it Hayes House, plain, her own name over the door in letters you could read from the bank, and on opening day the line went down the boardwalk past Pruitt's windows, and Mrs. Pruitt came, because Mrs. Pruitt could survive anything except being left out, and Della seated her personally, at the best table, by the window, and fed her perfectly, and charged her full price, and smiled, and that was the whole of her revenge, and everyone in the room understood it had been administered. He asked at Christmas, as warned, in the kitchen of Hayes House after closing, with the stockpot going on the back burner the way a stockpot should, and she said yes, and they were married in the spring, a year almost to the day from the night a boy bet a silver dollar on her loneliness. Half the territory came. Decker did not, but Decker's wife did, which students of Montana politics later marked as the true end of that war. Mrs. Lindqvist made the dress, green again, her color now. Pete Mullins gave the bride away on his bad hip and wept through every step of it. And the wedding supper, by the bride's own iron insistence, was cooked by her, for everyone, because the food was hers and the food was honest, and that had been true the whole time. Through every year they had refused to see her, and now they sat at her tables, all of them, in her building, with her name over the door, and they saw. Years on, When the railroad finally put its branch line through Antler Creek and the town doubled, and the old stories started getting told to people who hadn't lived them, the version that survived was a simple one. They mocked the plus-size cook, the old-timers would say, until the cattle baron stood on a supper table and set fire to 20 years of standing rather than hear it again. And he never missed it, the standing. Ask anyone. The man ate at Hayes' house every day of his life, at the small table nearest the kitchen door, the one with the wobbled leg, which his wife never let anybody fix, so that he would always have to sit very still and pay attention and stay close. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.